Hi, this is Michael Hogge. So this will be my last one. I'll talk about the birth of American Sign Language and the dark age of the sign language. So, I understand that in 1880, there was no documentation for helping the deaf children or learning or help them to build up a language itself, and a lot of people were struggling to educate the deaf children back in those days. But understand, in America, we didn't have the birth of the Merc silos at that time. So the man named Gallaudet Miller, I'm sorry, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, here this book I show that was about his lifestyle and how he brought Lord Clark to Gallaudet with him to America. So and his son his son Edward Miller Gallaudet, he also wrote the book about this. So for his father's things in 1888. So now a lot of deaf people aware that Thomas Thomas was very helpful of our community in different American side which along with Lord Clark. So understand he was graduated in alma mater at Yale University in 1805, and he was about 17 years old at that time. I remember correctly. So while he was traveling, he really fought a lot with religion, mostly Christianity, but not Christianity, but it's believed similar to that. So what happened here while he was traveling about a wealthy family of Coxwell family. And they had a daughter named Alice Coxwell. She really can't hear. She really don't talk very much. So Gallaudet himself, he was really fantastic with deaf commuting. So we had just I guess her father that she started to go to a deaf institution or deaf school somewhere in uh, Britain somewhere, that part of Ireland. But originally I understand because I was like supposed to be in Paris, but most of the actors Christian here, so unfortunately his father, I'm like her father, doesn't really agree with this artist and his daughter to outside of the country. Doesn't know how she's doing well, how's going on. She was really worrying. So Gallaudet himself, Thomas Gallaudet, he has a wonderful idea. He wanted to go to Paris to acquire old French sign language and to bring it to America to convert it to American sign language. And so the water family agrees and willing to pay for his trip from America to France. But first he went straight to England, part of that. But he found out there was a different community to go to Paris support. So what happened? When he went to Paris, he met Abby Sekar, an institution, and a part of that, he was met Lloyd Clark after this in 1815, who was his favorite student. That man, he was deaf and blind at the same time. So it was okay. It was really wonderful, man. He was educator himself. He was teaching students, deaf and blind students, both. So, so it's able guy that was able to convince Lord Clark to come with him to America. After 13 months of study in France, sorry, in Paris. So when Clark agrees, when Stuckhardt agree with this point because they found out there's no actual American Irish where he came from. So we was really concerned about it. It was like, okay, we can try to help them establish other culture, new side, which is interesting because in France, that's actual beginning of all side language. So usually overall the world that learn and adjust of the old language. It's just like ours to American side language from French side language. So what happened? Here, the wealthy families was able to buy large amount of money to buy land for them to establish a school. It was called Connecticut Asylum for the education and instruction of deaf and dumb persons. I'm talking about it's an old word saying, but it's really offensive nowadays. But we said deaf and blind institution, pretty much. So, but what happened overall at that time? They were able to create as much reward, much recognition of the whole community. So, what happened? I'm going to clarify a couple of things. While the establishing American side of which we understand the most of our language was used 50 to 60%. They were using in their French side, or French side, which is South. But it's very similar of ours. I think there's rules, stutters, figure spelling, but not same, I promise, but similar is, yeah. So, mother not just as cultural family. It's other wealthy families who have deaf children. You don't really want their children to acquire language, education, and culture. So, a lot of times, usually this point of world acquired education of deaf children for the deaf children usually is a lack of access. In the back of days, and unfortunately, that today is still happening in some countries. So, at the beginning of college institution, they had started with 7 students. And one of them was Alice Coxwell. So the father was thrilled to put his daughter in education and to learn language, culture, and able to communicate with that child for the first time. So they have 7 students. Most time, Lord Clerc was doing the teaching part of it, while Gallaudet was principal. So what happened at the end of 1817? They would expand the number of students. That was one institution. That institution is only one of them. So a lot of states were very interested in the size of deaf communities. And that deaf education just started to establish more and more and more and more all over the nation. So what happened? From some modest students went up to 30. And the numbers constantly increasing. And the part of that, the president of my first president, not president, that time it was Senator Mason, I think. So yeah, he was gave them more grants, funds to keep the school alive, especially which become fruition of the source for the deaf student. So that happens at this point. Until later they have a oralism movement. By the time they have people, not large but slowly grow in the amount of community, and they slowly become oralism movement. Unfortunately, which eventually this man named Alexander Graham Bell, who was a inventor of telephone. Unfortunately, it's hard for me to say this. It was just, so what happened? His whole belief didn't like deaf children to learn a sign language that belonged to a different country, which he felt concerned and called primitive language. Meanwhile, for Gallaudet, the one to develop American Sign Language for the deaf children of the community and have their own acquired culture and language, which spelled out really 3 years apart. So I have to say they have different morals, different beliefs, different education, both sides. They have different ways of how helping children. For Miller Gallaudet, Alexander Graham Bell, he actually want the children to learn how to speak fluency and oralism all the way. And unfortunately, he part of that years of that kind of vibration in the vocal. So I actually teach the children how the sound works, how the vibrate, the frequency, the pitch. A lot of times it was struggling part of that to understand. So part of relapse, which is unfortunately, so it's very misstanding because it's very limited to catch a certain word. And unfortunately, the certain words have similar with other words, which are getting up again very confusing for most people, most of the community. Really agrees this part, but at that time, we had a called the Dark Age of Sign Language in 1880, which called the Milan Conference of 1880 is in Italy, where they gathered up all the educators. And all that educator, none of them were the deaf teacher, but unfortunately, none of them were. So a lot of them had their own ways, assumption that was some only the best way to approach. And unfortunately, that's not really the benefit, but it became a backstabbing. Well, not word right or backstabbing, but kind of pushed back that way. So, but that point, we have the whole passive benefit of learning silos, but the other countries have not developed any of their own silos at that time. So they feel like only best way to approach is awesome way, but understand that Alexa Graham Bell have small influence and that election. So a lot of people at that time was openly willing to ban sign language to force deaf students or hard of hearing students to learn how to speak, how to read lips. So that point that this happened, and deaf children doesn't really like a lot of understanding, a lot of frustrations, but this point, so ways of their life. They're able to acquire language, also develop the rules, and able to communicate with people and their own community. So what happened? The oralism movement and eugenics was growing so massive after that bill passed in the Milan Battleman and America law that changed the law that passed it out. No, that America didn't have did this yet. But what happened? His son, who wrote this book in 1888, that's 80 years after the bill passed. Well, it's published by 1888. So those years, he wanted people to understand that his father's dangerously that actually acquired sign language and able to help the deaf community grow to able to have their own language, their own communication. And that part, our movement and eugenics, well, eugenics was more dangerous for that community, but I'll spell that out later. So, yeah, actually, Graham Bell himself was castrated eugenics informant, a man with oralism, but not direct fall straight to it. Eugenics, no. I mean, his belief was similar with their movement's belief. So a lot of time he tried to argue about that marriage. That culture is pointless. And he felt it was really not make the deaf children of a humanity of a higher level. At that time in 1880 was have a lot of the true movements really that actually rejected the deaf community, go through a lot of struggles. For example, because of destitution, a public school, those both movements came to the school and tell the teachers that the kids must not learn sign language. And unfortunately, it became a greater discrimination at that time. When they tried to talk to their friends with through salad or hand gesture, even small, not such gesture, small thing. Like this high, for example, what happened of people who had heard the education movement or some movement, they are encouraging the parents, the teachers, the adults. It's okay to give them corporal punishment. So people have different ways how to define corporal punishment, from minor, a small discipline, to small like discouragement. Like small, what happened was massive. It can be crazy. It can be really cruel, brutal, which can be really got blood all over, like physical abuse, straight beat up. So, unfortunately, of Alexander Graham Bell, he just let that happen. And I really protected them children, which is strange because in his family, the Bell's family, they have, he was born from a deaf mother and he married a deaf wife. But unfortunately, at this point, his father was the biggest influence. I mean, emphasize this really huge, and his father was one who invented verbal, the part of the throat, that vibrates, and actually teach the deaf children to rely only on the vibrate. Unfortunately, part of that they did not understand. When I use only vibrate, and part of that the goal is to make the deaf children able to talk, but it's really complex. Just rely only vibrate because a lot of words when they're missing out from hearing, either missing out or hearing nothing. So it became a huge waste of time for their education and their language development. So, unfortunately, at that point, Thomas Gallaudet and Edward Miller and Clerc, all three of them had a strong appraisal of the deaf community, by the deaf community. So they developed the Act for Salaries, and that eventually the former president of the United States named Abraham Lincoln gave Gallaudet University University credit. At that time, his son Edward established the deaf community to really protect the deaf community from eugenics and oralism movement. That's a huge influence of the critical role battle. So what happened is when the deaf children were struggling to develop the American language or their own language, they had people, disciplined children that would struggle to learn part of sign language. Maybe they never learned from it. So what happened in public school and private institution, they have something called cigarette buffers. So I describe that like cigarette club. They call it cigarette buffers, but and make it acceptable for the community and not be target a disciplined action or the deaf children who already learn American language. And as a part of that, they were able to gather freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, and children below the age gap, those that have not developed American language. Maybe just move in, maybe they transfer to a different school, maybe just got in because of freshmen. What happened? the deaf children were able to develop the Merksala language. But already happens, and they would teach those students have not learned to learn a Merksala language in order for the language to develop, to grow, to become the own language. So at that point, it's been passed on. The deaf children for years and years and years. It's between 60 to 8. I'm sorry, 80 to 100 years that was being passed on. And after that, the people were changing the rules and they found out, hold on a minute, those kind of laws and rules that was actually creating during the Mountain Conference, and they decided to batch out some countries to just unban that law of their own language to be able to learn it recently, unfortunately, really recently, somewhere in 2010. 2015, a couple countries is filing a ban to allow the deaf community to actually grow their own language. That's sad, but it's wonderful news filing ban it so they can actually develop their own. So, part of Alexander Graham Bell is believed straightening from a eugenics movement, not directly, but he has similar beliefs. He argued a lot about deaf marriage should not be allowed. He wanted the deaf children to get a certain, what's that called, starting out fashion they were not able to produce in order to give birth to children. At the point he was cautioned, he was afraid of deaf children to replace the human community at this point, and he was so wrong for that because he doesn't understand that much very small, very little bit of deaf community in this world can never replace human community. So what happened? He tried to argue his son, Thomas Edward's son, Gallaudet, Edward. So Thomas Gallaudet's son, Edward, yes, Edward, to actually go to England to argue in the parliament for try to protect the deaf community. And the point of Edward, he wanted to make sure that deaf children requires different ways of lessons or learning coming from only sign language. There can be sign language speaking mix. It's called piercing. There can be only speaking, allowing acquired full spectrum for the deaf children to actually acquire how they feel like it that is most helpful or the most successful in their life. But a lot of times that Edward Alexander were like water and oil. They don't get along really. So for the Edward's part, he was allowed with deaf children or deaf community to marry whoever they want. Even deaf marriage, which Alexander really despite the argument. So he's trying to argue about pigs, two deaf pigs that actually give birth, all of them were deaf pigs. They're trying to use that inference to not allow deaf people to be married, or whoever they want. Unfortunately, that part, I think Alexander heard enough of information from Edward's father, his father of Thomas Gallaudet, who did so many amazing things. And he felt like that shouldn't have that happen. But that kid should be part of the human community. As I said, it shouldn't be part of the culture, the owns the language. Don't need it. Just swap it out. It's only oralism Yiddish, part of Yiddish. I understand what happens. A lot of that community from many years until today really really hangs Alexander Graham Bell deepening. Unfortunately, despite his background of deaf mother and deaf wife, he still didn't really understand that part of it how to help. Especially during that the movement in the point timeline that Merck Salah was just banned and he was straight when the moment is banned. But despite his little flip was that part, so we understand the part that happens. But understand the argument since 1990s, the Eddie law passed it. We had the suit petition, included with other disability communities. But unfortunately, and not entirely protected against the eugenics movement, but eventually at that point that slowly decreased in the community and disappearing channel. I understand that many people know this movement is still ongoing, but I understand it's not large as before. But in that part of America and here, we're actually passing some laws to protect more of that community where we can't discriminate. But not enough. In the case that eugenics movement rising again, we don't know what happens. But in conclusion, Thomas Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc create American Sign Language. And they brought it from Paris by creating their own language, which was called ASL. And for the deaf community, I create culture, the linguistic culture, and everything. So, but his hard work made that happen. And I'm really, really grateful that Edward, his son, Thomas Gallaudet's son, actually protected his father's interesting. So, it's interesting that protected the deaf community in America side which for many, many years. But we have even though we have that much recognition that began during the charity that almost demolished by the anti-Mellon conference. So, Alexander Graham Bell not entirely protect the deaf community. The deaf community is the language, not entirely, but I try to teach only oralism they thought best replacement to the language itself. Nope. So, yeah, only approach if it does believe. So, unfortunately, Bell's institution will support oralism movement, but also eugenics movement in some ways. And the deaf community in today's era, we have a real problem with Alexander Graham Bell. And also, the end of this, we're really thankful Thomas' son, Edward Gallaudet, has tried to protect his father's legacy and the deaf community from the threat of suppression of all the true oralism. Thanks for watching.